Hey everyone, welcome to video number 1 for chapter 23, which will be on the growth of Western democracies. So by the late 1800s, some countries in Western Europe had started to transition away from absolute monarchies where the king or the emperor had total control, and they were transitioning into more democratic forms of government. Not many of them, but one such country that was transitioning was Great Britain. Throughout the 1800s, Great Britain was still a monarchy, okay, so that's important to remember. Easy way to remember it, though, is that it's still a monarchy today, but it's a constitutional monarchy where the Queen has little to no real political authority. Now, this movement towards a limited monarchy, that began, hundreds of years ago, and it really picked up steam and continued through the 1800s, this period we're going to be talking about in this first video. And it got going with a series of significant reforms, and much of this centered around the role of Parliament. Now, Parliament, you should remember, is the legislative branch of the British government, meaning it makes the laws. It's the equivalent to our Congress. The institution of Parliament had been around since the Middle Ages, but had traditionally been dominated by the upper class. A major reason for this was that historically, voting rights in first England and then later Great Britain had been very restricted. By the year 1815, less than 5% of the people in Britain had the right to vote. It was restricted to men, and you had to own property. Plus, you had to be a member of the Church of England, which meant if you were a Catholic, no good, you could not vote. So the first change was in dealing with religious restrictions. And so this ended in the 1820s, that religious restrictions on voting ended. So that means Catholics, now they get the thumbs up. But not only Catholics, but non-Anglican Protestants could vote as well. A much more problematic issue, though, is how to fix what became known as rotten boroughs. Now, the first thing to know about rotten boroughs is that representation in Parliament worked the same way as it does in our own House of Representatives. It's based on population. States that have large populations like California send more representatives than states that have small populations like Idaho. The same system worked for areas known as boroughs in Great Britain in the 17 and 1800s. Rotten boroughs were rural or country towns that had lost much of their population due to industrialization and people moving to the cities. This became a problem politically for the wealthy landowners who remained in the countryside in their big manor houses. They wanted to keep their representation in government, so they kept sending the same amount of people to Parliament even though they didn't deserve it based on population. What did they do? They paid them. Okay, so here you see the government official on the left and the wealthy landowner on the right, essentially buying their votes, buying their representation in Parliament. Representatives from industrial cities were getting outvoted in Parliament, even though they represented much larger populations. The battle over rotten boroughs eventually led to the Reform Act of 1832. This redistributed seats in Parliament based on accurate population levels. It pretty much eliminated rotten boroughs. Okay, you see this famous political cartoon where the rotten borough is represented by the tree, and you can kind of make out that you've got the rich, noble, wealthy landowners that are trying to hold it up, and then you've got working class and reformers that are all coming with their axes to chop it down. It also enlarged the electorate. The electorate are the people who could vote, although universal male suffrage was still a ways away. It did not grant suffrage to the lower and working classes. That's important to remember. Owning property was still a requirement. Now, these reforms took place right before an era of British history known as the Victorian Age. It was called this because it was under the rule of Queen Victoria, and she ruled from 1837 to 1901, and that made her the longest ruling monarch in English history up until her great-great-granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth, surpassed her in 2015. By the time Victoria came to the throne, the monarch didn't have much real political power, but she was still very influential culturally. She came to represent the values of the times, what became known as Victorian ideals, and they included duty, hard work, respectability especially. Victoria herself tried to live life by these values. An awful lot of our stereotype of what we consider to be, kind of the proper English gentleman, that comes from the Victorian age. These values, they had a big impact on different social classes, particularly the middle and the lower classes. They emboldened them. Both tried to improve their status in society. The working class was picking up momentum, and the middle class, through industrialization and these Victorian ideals, they tried to achieve a higher level of respectability. the working, we'll talk about that again in a second. One other point of note about the Victorian age was the size of the empire. It got a lot bigger. Let's look at the map here. You have areas that were still under the Commonwealth realm, such as Canada. Okay, that often gets overlooked, but remember the Queen of England is on their money up there. You've got the UK, but that includes Ireland. You've got areas in South America, even some small areas in the Caribbean, even though it's too small to show it. You've got an expanding presence here in Britain. You've got all of Indian subcontinent. You've got Indonesia, British New Guinea, Hong Kong here. That's a very important area, as well as Australia and New Zealand. The saying used to be that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and for a while that was correct. It was accurate. So big empire, but we're going to talk more about empire building in a later chapter. So the Victorian age also gave rise to some new reforms. The late 1800s saw the rise of two dominant political parties in Parliament, and that was the Liberal and Conservative parties. Here you see them represented in political cartoon by their leaders. This was William Gladstone, who was a leader of the Liberal Party, and Benjamin Disraeli here on the left, who was a leader of the Conservative Party, and they would kind of go back and forth in terms of their stewardship of the Prime Minister position. They were the big rivals throughout the Victorian age. So both parties pushed for reform in order to stay in power. In 1867, a new reform bill from the Conservative Party gave even more men the right to vote, and then the Liberals pushed their own bill through Parliament that further extended voting rights, and by 1900, universal male suffrage had been achieved. So Britain by this point had effectively become... Well, you see kind of the political cartoon of, Disraeli kind of leading this figure of liberty, perfect political equality to the parliamentary height. So now everybody can take part in Parliament, and that turns Britain into what we call a parliamentary democracy, where the people choose the members of Parliament and the Prime Minister, which is a bit different from our own version. You look at the presidential relationship where voters will vote for the legislative branch and the executive branch, chief executive, that's the Prez. Okay, they vote for those separately. Okay, this is Congress. This is the president and then the members of it. So we vote for the president and then we vote for Congress separately. The way it works in a parliamentary relationship is that the voters vote for a political party in the legislative branch. So in our own system, it would be like, okay, are we going to vote for Democrat or Republican? Suppose the Democrats win. The Democrats in the legislative branch would then choose the chief executive, who is the prime minister in Great Britain. Okay, so the people do not directly vote for the chief executive. All right, so that's a big difference between presidential and parliamentary governments. But the end result of this was that the monarchy was becoming more and more of a figurehead position. Britain's parliament was divided into two houses. You have the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and it's easy to tell by their titles that the House of Lords traditionally held the power. The Lords, obviously. Commons were the commoners. That changed by the 20th century as all working class men gained the right to vote. And by 1911, the House of Commons had gained supremacy over the House of Lords. Today, the House of Lords is a largely ceremonial body, and everything in British government goes through the House of Commons. All right, so there's an overview over the some political reforms that we saw, as well as a brief overview over what we're talking about with the Victorian age. And in the next video, we'll talk about social and economic reforms in Britain from this time period.